Hello, everyone. I hope each and every one of you is doing really well. My name is Ravi Padmanawar. I'm going to be your host for today. I'm really excited to welcome you all for the 11th Baltimore MuleSoft Meetup Group. And especially, this is the first one this year. So, thank you a lot for taking out the time to participate in this meetup. With me today, I have Charles from MuleSoft, who's going to talk to us about MuleSoft as a composability in itself, composable architecture with respect to the MuleSoft as well, and share his experience working with different customers and clients in the past, and how this composable architecture is very crucial for an organization in being agile as well as successful in their futuristic product or futuristic solutions. I kindly request all of you to introduce yourself if you have not done in the chat window. I have also enabled audio and video for the first 50 audiences over here. So at any point of a time, if you want to speak, just raise your hand or just send a message in the chat, and then go ahead and myself as well as Charles will take questions. Without further ado, let's get into the agenda for today. As usual, we'll kick off this meetup with the introductions, and then we'll jump into the main topic, that is composability. Charles would be the one presenting the topic for today. Once it's introduced to composability, we'll go through a little bit of history of composability, composable architecture, basically the evolution of the composable architecture and what it is. And then finally, we will go into what it has to do with an API and the API design in particular. You will be also sharing the secrets of API design from a composability standpoint. And then there would be a Q&A time allocated for the team. Again, the Q&A time is a specific time allocated. However, I would encourage each and every one of you to ask question on the chat, and a speaker would be taking up the questions as and when it comes to a logical stop. So don't hold yourself. Feel free to raise the questions. Also, I love interactions. So if you have any questions, any comments, any experience that you want to share, leverage the chat to do that. That way, we also get to learn from you. Well, then after Q&A, as usual, we would have a trivia quiz, and there are some vouchers to be won. So be alert through these sessions. There'll be a lot of information shared, and there'll be the basis for these questions as well. And finally, we will close up with some information about the upcoming events and information about the feedbacks I can give or how we can participate into the meetup. With that, let's talk about the safe harbor statement first. That's a usual trend that we have. What we want to highlight here is that both speaker and myself are organizing this meetup in our individual capacity. We are not representing our companies. Second point is that this presentation is strictly for the learning purpose only. We, organizer or presenter, do not hold any responsibility that the same solution or recommendations would work for your business requirements. So please always keep that in mind. The idea here is to share how our experiences, both good and bad, helped us in our journey in learning, as well as helping achieve some of the outcomes for our customers. So always keep that in mind. Everyone's journey could be different. Third point is that this presentation is not meant for any promotional activities. This is solely meant for educational purposes. And finally, as mentioned earlier, this would be recorded and shared on the event page. Let's kick off with the introduction. As I think most of you already know, I'm one of the MuleSoft Baltimore Meetup Group's organizer, and today I would be the moderator for this particular session. I'm Ravi Padmanawar. I'm a customer success strategic advisor here at MuleSoft. I work in a group called as Customer Success Strategy and Architecture team. I have more than 18 plus of experience in IT, mostly in the BFSI domain, but also a little bit in the healthcare domain as well. I have 5 plus years of a MuleSoft experience, and that too as an architect and as a senior lead as well. I have been with MuleSoft from January 2021, and it's been an amazing experience working with MuleSoft itself. Apart from that, I have a MuleSoft certification and few domain-specific certifications as well. And I'm also a finance meetup group leader, which is a new meetup group which we kickstarted this year. And I'm really excited for that group as well because it's specific to the financial domains or financial customers where they can learn a lot about domain-specific insights. And I would love if you shower some love for that meetup group as well. And finally, I'm based out of Washington D.C. For the last 5 years, but I was also in Central Illinois for another 5 years in my journey here. That's pretty much about me. With that, I'll hand over to Charles to introduce himself as well as take us through the today's topic. Over to you, Charles.
Okay, are you going to advance the slide for me? Can you hear me?
Yes, Charles, we can hear you, and I'm sharing your screen.
Okay, so for a moment it is paused. Welcome everyone. I'm very privileged and proud to be speaking here today in this meetup. And a little bit of background as just Ravi introduced himself. I recently joined the MuleSoft, in fact, just in November last year. So I'm still fresh. And before I joined the MuleSoft, I worked in a lot of different industries. We, Ravi and I, for example, we share some of the banking industry. I work for SunTrust Bank, Bank of America, and some other financial insurance companies. I also had experience in healthcare industry, and I actually was proud to be the chief architect for the Missouri state government in the federal exchange program with the Obamacare program. So that was very good experience. And I also have experience in transportation. So recently, actually immediately before I joined MuleSoft, I was with the Norfolk Southern. It's one of the large train companies in the United States. So that's very good. Actually, I learned from my experience from all these different industries. And in the past 10 years, I tend to focus a lot of times on the strategy part. I I would wanted to see IT strategy, but in fact, because of the technology these days, has deeply embedded into business. So I actually have the experience crossing the line of business and technology. And most of the time, I focus on digital innovation. Just not IT. We actually digitalize the business processes, business artifacts, and the business interaction experience with customers, and also the business transformation. Myself, I heavily specialize in enterprise architecture and integration. I used to be a developer myself. That's where I inherited a lot of the experience from there. And especially in the banking industry, I mostly work on like ROI improvement, total cost of ownership, those kind of things that very generalized, I would say, in technology space. And in the MuleSoft, I'm trying to learn as you do, probably some of you, and I tend to focus on a lot of the benefits of the platform when it comes to API design, API governance, and API monetization. So that's a little bit about myself. And the next page. So for today, I mean, the topic we can talk about for today is about composability and composable architecture. I mean to make this as fun as possible because this is a very dry topic. Um, Ravi told me you need to put more pictures, diagrams. I wanted to do that, but apologize because of time. I had to prepare for the deck, and those things are time consuming. Even though I had some of them, but I didn't want to have the client information embedded in those pictures. So a lot of them do not have a lot of graphics, but I want to make this as interactive as possible. So if you have a question, feel free to ask. And I think Ravi told me that the platform may not allow you to actually ask a question directly. I hope that would be the case. But you can raise your questions in the chat area. And also, I would love to hear your story, if possible. I don't know how we can, maybe Ravi can open up the microphone, if in some cases. I don't know if that's possible. Let Ravi decide about it. So,
Hey Charles,
without
the
further, yeah,
participants. So sorry to interrupt. The participants are allowed to share their video as well as they're allowed to speak on this meetup. So we are all good.
okay, excellent. So I would like to make this as interactive as possible. If you don't mind, you can interrupt me, you can speak, ask questions, share your video, for example, and let's learn together. Without further ado, I put a little bit of forwards here. So these days, we heard a lot of API. This topic has become very popular. Why you are here? Because of the MuleSoft platform. We are a promoter of APIs. Just tell you a little bit of background. In fact, is that when the API buzzword first came out, I told you earlier, I came from a developer background. And for example, I used to actually write even desktop applications. So application programming interface wasn't anything new to me. I was so wondering what is going on. I mean, all of a sudden, a decades later, and people start to present this API thing as something revolutionary and everyone is talking about it. I didn't think it was different. I just said, okay, this is old school things. I even sometimes speak publicly, telling people, oh, I knew this decades ago. I was working on those APIs. So that was my impression. And some of you may share the same experience as well if you actually did the API programming in the past. But what it has to do with our modern information technology right now. So that's what I'm going to talk about, why API is becoming more popular and also why people is trying to step up with the API concept. It's an old concept, but we give it a new life. So that's important. All this has to do with the composable architecture. That is the reason that people found out that API has its new life and it's not just the old days in those hide behind the cubicle people dealing with them. So then what is the question is that composable architecture, what it means? How do I use it? That's the question I'm going to answer today. And I'm not saying that all of these are 100% well defined, but we'll see how it means in our life. And I will share with you different definitions and different views on this. And especially, in my opinion, what's the criteria to be successful? Next slide, please. It's a little bit of latency, I noticed, but we can live with it. So what is composability? The composability is a little bit different from composable architecture, at least in my opinion. And after I finish talking about this, I will probably hear your opinion about it. The composability idea, the first thing come to mind, I just gave you a joke that Ravi, come on, Charlie, you have to put on some Lego picture there. So I put on Lego picture there. A lot of people use a Lego picture to represent the composable architecture. I agree with it. I didn't use it. It was for a reason. I don't think it's that simple. If it's just Lego, everyone can use it. Correct? So I think it's more than just Lego. But anyway, I put the picture because that's how people understand what Lego is. So Lego explained one part of the concept that is composability. And we remember, if we go back to the history, in the 1980s, all the developers, that's my privilege. I told you I used to be a developer. We were pushing for modularization. When you design a software system, IT system, or even desktop applications, modularization was the key. You have to modularize it. The boss will tell you, your team leader will tell you. If you don't do modularization, they consider you as how to say the procedural programmer. So that's the difference. And in the 1990s, the service-oriented architecture came into the picture, and the people assumed that was it. That's the future. Everything going on to services. And that's the time actually when I joined Bank of America, I was an enterprise architect and hired as the lead for the SOA education and adoption for the bank. So I did a lot of this foundational work trying to teach people what the SOA is and how the IT can benefit from it. And very quickly, we run into challenges. With the services, it doesn't seem to realize the benefits that we all wanted for. It's difficult to define. A year later, when you define the SOA service, you thought it was very well defined, and 1 year later, we realized that's not the case. We have to constantly change this. We end up with thousands, I mean, if I would say several thousand kind of services across the bank, and we have different organizations. Of course, Bank America itself consists of 4 banks, so we actually end up with tons of services that even duplicate or overlap each other. It become very complicated. So at that time was so we used the concept actually in the services oriented. Let's define an abstract service. So the implementation will different. And also by abstract the service, we can actually have different versions and different implementations to use with that. We actually, at that time, I even use a term called it API. It's just like the API we used to deal with in the old days. I always, because I once read a book, I mean, honestly, I don't read a lot of books, but I once read a book. It's called Design by Interface. That book gave me a lot of influence. I always remembered the interface is so important when you design information system or integrate with the software systems. Essentially, the interface is the API. So that's why I always say it's not a new concept, but it's an old concept, but we give it new life. So recently, the API become very popular, and everyone knows that MuleSoft is the API-led approach platform for you to utilize the benefits of the APIs. Then, as I said earlier, we're talking about composability. Is the same thing? This is just a lot of buzzword, nothing new. I'm going to talk about on this to expand it into the composable architecture, which, in my opinion, is slightly different from the traditional composability itself. Next slide, please. So let's first go to Gartner. And when I was trying to make this presentation, I was him. Let's Google what Gartner says about it. So because that's what a little bit of joke here is that I used to have a doctor in Boston, Massachusetts. I always ask him some tough questions, and he always laugh at me. You can become a doctor, okay, by just the research on the internet. And I showed him a medicine. He said, I can write an article about it as well. But I said, it's made in Japan. He said, that must be good. So this is something we always go to Gartner for definitions. That's what I do as well. I'm not saying always 100% Gartner is right, but at least it's well perceived as our authorities in this kind of how to say frontier definitions. So Gartner, in one of the articles, I don't know, you actually have a link underlined the Gartner. You can go to download that white paper and read about it. Gartner defines the composable architecture to include business architecture, technologies, and thinking. This is a very important definition. So composable architecture is not just about composability, which you have Legos, you can put them together and create something. At first, it has to have a business architecture. And also the article says that's at the center of the composable architecture. I will explain why later on. And the last thing, actually, I didn't realize before I Googled Gatter's definition, thinking. I think the thinking part is the art component of the composable architecture. What it means, we'll talk about it later on, but just everyone be ready to think about these three components that Gartner says. That is the complete definition and components of composable architecture versus the composability we're all familiar with. If you ever did programming or did in the IT industry for long enough, nevertheless, you use the composability. But is that composable architecture? It may be not. So next slide. Okay, I will pause for a moment if to see anyone has any questions, especially with the gutter definitions, because sometimes people may read something different. If you have any different perspective about the composable architecture, before I dive into the details here with you, my experience, I would love to hear if you have any different thoughts. Okay, so that's silence, which means it's good. I'm on the right track. Otherwise, people probably will shout at me, say, "Hey, no, that's we have something different." But anyway, so let's get one step further into this composable architecture. I actually, based on my reading of the Gartner, I created my own, how to say, common definition. I think a composable architecture is a business-oriented, standards-based approach that often leverages the API-led and event-driven architecture. It consists of the four most important components, in my opinion. This is probably, you will read something different from somewhere else, but this is my flavor of interpretation and my secret sauce for the composable architecture based on my experience. So it might be different. I'm open for debates, and I can hear from you what you have read about and what you think about it, and let's make it interactive. So, in my opinion, the first one, to be able to practice composable architecture, you really have to have a business model in mind. If you don't have a business model in mind, that's the same thing. You go into a block of bricks you're trying to lay out, but what you are trying to lay out, like Legos, you bought a bag of Legos. Do you have any idea what you are trying to create? And in today's practice, actually, I worked with a lot of organizations. Sometimes we have the situations that the IT organization or even different developer the organization or teams of developments that creates their own APIs that can compose something within their own space, but they don't know what the company is doing. So have no clue, for example, across the wall, the next department, what they worry about. So that's what I called, we used to have this composability practice or experience, but without the business model. I'm going to explain why. You are not going to have the true composable architecture. The second thing, very important, is the standards. Without the standards, you can't do composable architecture because just I use example, your two departments, one is finance, back office, development organization versus your branch, a consumer bank, which has totally different setups, and you will not be able to talk to each other without standards. And especially when we talk about monetization these days, that's a hot topic I'm actually newly getting into at MuleSoft, the industry standards. So this I use this word standards by itself because really there are a lot of standards we're talking about, but I just want to stress the importance of standards, whether it's your internal taxonomies. For example, how you name your business process, how you name a business data object, you need to have agreed upon common understanding. If you don't have that agreed on definition, then you run into problems. Data structure, business process difference, and invocation, a method or API definition, people think in one way, but it does something else or incomplete. I got a question from Ravi. Question: how many of you are working as architects? Okay, I guess that's not to me. Um, Sometimes I call myself evangelist, not even real architect. Just a joke. So that's important, and and also pay attention to industry standards. When we talk about composable architecture, it's not just within your organization itself. In many cases, you are integrating or you are actually extending your software or service calls to external environment. That's where the standards comes in importantly. There are some very old standards like EDI, for example. If you don't talk to your partners in their EDI format, then you cannot compose your business systems together. And also there's SOA standards, there's REST standards. So all of these standards is important. Regardless, a new standards will come out, and I'm talking about here is just bear in mind that no matter you do it internally or externally, standards are very important. The third thing I'm talking about is API-led approach. To actually do the composable architecture, you don't really have to depend on the API for the sake, but the API-led approach is the best approach because it standardized interface, it provides the abstraction, and you don't have to deal with the complexities behind the API. That's actually is the real power of the MuleSoft platform. So that I actually run into these challenges in the past with some companies, some legacy IT teams that said, "Oh, we can do this. We can use messaging systems. We can use a file-based. I mean, all we care is about the data format, right? So why do you have to use an API? It's overhead." In their opinion, it introduced complexity. So you will hear this when you work with your counterparts. I mean, in a lot of companies, even today, you'll be surprised that, for example, FTP server-based integration is still widely used out there. Is that an API? Loosely defined, you could call it an API. But when we talk about API here, we're talking about very specific. That's where the new definition we gave to API. API in the most generic sense, it can be anything that serves as an application programming interface. But here we're more talking about REST-based and JSON-based API approach. So that is industry standards. That's where we goes back to the standards, not just any API, the API based on the most widely acceptable industry standards. And the last one, a lot of people think it's irrelevant, but my personal opinion, it's very relevant, is the event-driven architecture. I'm a very big promoter of the event-driven architecture. I remember that back in those days when we heavily utilized the service-oriented architecture and people promote solo. Even at that time, I tried to introduce the concept that we're not just doing services. Otherwise, you get into the point-to-point integrations a lot of times. We are going for the event-driven based services. So you will see this is going to be very important concept, and you're going to benefit from it when you design your system, and you're going to find it more flexible and more efficient in every corner. Any questions? Wow, we have a very quiet cloud. Next page, Ravi. I actually talk about this because I wanted to stress the importance of an API approach. So probably I'm not going to speak a lot to this because I think all of you understand if you're sitting here, a MuleSoft customer, what API is. API is the bonding ingredient for all those composable blocks. But by itself, it's not an architecture. It's just a way of building software systems. That's what I want you to understand. I want to emphasize is that MuleSoft gives you the advantage in an API-led approach. So if you're here, I'm very proud of you. You made the best choice. Next slide, please. So here we're actually going to go deeper. I said earlier my secret source for the composable architecture. I talk about the business model. And what is a business model here? A lot of different definitions. In many times, for example, when I was work for Capgemini, I dealt with a lot of customers. People actually interpret business model in a different ways, but loosely use it. People think that the business model is how their business is making money. Simply put, I agree with it. So it depends on who you talk with. People may give you a process or may give you a graphic of those 9 blocks. I think there is leading industry um, person that described about how business is making money, so called a business model. But be careful is that since we are dealing with composable architecture, when we say business model, that is correct. You can loosely define that as how you make money, but I'm more focusing on a capability model. Based on how the business makes money, a very top level business model, you will have to create capability model to align with that high level business model. Without one level down, it's very difficult to do composable architecture. And if some of you um, are architects in your organization, especially for enterprise architects, you may know how important the capability model is. So look at the picture, for example. I put a very simple picture, not complex, just serve for the purpose of giving an idea what I'm talking about. So for example, if your business is in a retail business, you have a lot of capabilities that you would break them into. For example, you want to do an order taking, you want to do an inventory check, and you want to make a payment, the customers to make payments, or you want to ship the products to the final customers. And these capabilities can reside within your own organization. They can also reside in your partner's organization. In other words, you can actually have the capability anywhere if you can implement the composable architecture. The reason why this capability model is so that will, as I said, without a end design, a model in mind, with Legos itself, it doesn't produce any outcome. Yes, you can compose something, but that something it's useless. Only if you have a real business model, that's where you can actually design your Lego into something that is usable. People will say, aha, That's what exactly what I want. And then you can reuse the same block somewhere else. So this is a very important concept. And most of the times, I think when people talk about composable architecture, people are not referring to business model often enough. At least, especially in some IT organizations, they overlooked at this. They think this is something beyond their reach, beyond their control. I go back to the example I gave you, two departments. One is the back office, the serve HR, and then there's other one is marketing department, for example. In the same organization, they may do things very differently. If you own enterprise organizational-wide capability model, then the two departments will build their own something. Do the do the code integrate with each other? Are they compatible? Can you reuse them? Probably not. But if you have your enterprise-wide capability model in mind, you know that your organization consists of these two major organizations. Then where you're going to analyze, for example, is the employee a customer as well? It could be. So if there's an employee log in, or you're trying to market it towards employee, or you're trying to process an order from employee, you might have some of the integrations that you can never reach their API and the services together. So that's what I want to lead you to think about. Think about your business, not just a business function or a REST service accomplish something. So, any questions or your experience you want to share with the rest of the audience here? Okay, I guess everyone lunchtime. So
Yeah, I think we are good
next,
here, Charles, and I'm also having an
okay,
offline conversation, so we are good with the folks here. Yeah, carry on. Thank you.
okay, next slide. So these are several slides. I'm just trying to give you more explanation of why I think these components are important. So the second tip is the standards. I emphasized how important it is. Standards is the key to your success. If you don't base your composability on standards, be careful here. I use the term composability because standards itself is not an architecture. It's just a means of achieving something. To achieve composability, you need standards. And the standards, if you look at the bottom of the slide, I mainly break it into two types of standards. One is common business language. This is a little bit abstract. The business language is that, for example, when you define your capability model, you want to bear on your mind, you want to standardize the business language. The marketing departments, especially sales team, they use a lot of jargons that the IT teams sometimes don't understand. And when they use their jargons, they may be very different from a back office HR department or even like a shipping department. So if you carefully learn the language, you will find the correspondence between those jargons. That's where the architect, especially a business architect or enterprise architect, needs to understand. And everyone in the organization, and even beyond the organization, I'm going to sneeze, excuse me for a moment. I have energy. Every every spring, terrible. So even beyond your own organization, at the industry level, what language do they speak? You need to understand that. So that will help you create your standards, then make your API more composable because everyone understands what you are trying to do, what you are trying to introduce by literally looking at your business language. They can understand what you are trying to do based on their common industry knowledge. So that's one thing very important. I encourage everyone, API designers, to learn the business language. And the second thing is more relevant to the IT team is the common data structure and the semantics. Imagine that I said earlier that, for example, FTP integration is still popular at some organizations. They have a comma delimited text-based data format. It works well with them. Why it works well? Because everyone is so used to that data format. They know every line is a record. They know every column, especially mainframe programmers, they understand precisely at that point what it is, the data. So semantics is important, but with those structure flight files, it's not efficient because it's proprietary. And when we talk about data structure and semantics, we have to adopt to industry standards. Then this is the challenge. In a lot of industries, especially with JSON-based data formats, not many standards you can actually look into. But this is where you need to well define your data structure and semantics. You may have to have documentation, you may have to have a training. And one thing I encourage everyone to form industry alliance. Discuss this with other similar businesses outside of your organization. If you can create a common data structure that is widely accepted by other similar businesses in your industry, then you are much better positioned to be successful. I encourage people to do this is for two reasons. One is that it's going to make it easier for you to maintain your API or your composable extension of those business systems because everyone use the common structure. If you don't use the common structure, then the result is that you keep on changing it in order to make it work. And when you have too many variants that are no longer compatible, then it's no longer a composable business anymore. The second thing is that if you create these industry work groups, you can lead the industry to the way that you would like to influence them. Then you are always at the frontier, at the edge of this definition. Then you are going to find yourself less often or less likely to change your own because you are influencing the industry. Then other people will probably feel obligated or feel much more um, influenced by your ideas, so they would follow yours. A lot of large companies they invested a lot of time and resources in these industry groups. That's why the reason they're doing it. So when we talk
Uh,
about standards, these are the
Hey Charles,
yeah.
I completely understand the importance of the business model and the standards that you are mentioning over here. And again, I don't want to take much of a time. We are running short of it anyway. But my one question is that are there any organizations or is there any architecture group that is trying to come up with all these business models or standards that will help an organization be that a composable, enterprise or like that?
Yes. I give you three examples. For the banking industry, there is a common language model for the financial industry, which is led by IBM. IBM works with most large financial organizations in the world to create the common language. So that's a very widely adopted one. For the healthcare industry, in fact, the government, the Center for Healthcare, Center for Medicaid and Medicare, they define the standards. So if you are in the healthcare industry, like for example, digital health records, they define the semantics. And for transportation, many people don't understand it's a very narrow industry. They actually have a railway association, and there is there's a company that actually funded by all the railway companies that define the standards as well in terms of interoperability. So it depends on the industry you are in. Many of them that have already have this established.
Got
Did
it,
I answer
Charles.
that
And
question?
just to add to that,
Okay.
yes, yes, you did. And just to add to that, for a banking industry, there's a group called as Bayan. Bayan is a non-profit consortium of a lot of technical firms as well as banking leaders that bring together a team, and they have come up with a business object model that could help us achieve to be a composable enterprise. So if anyone is interested in knowing more about Bayan, I intend to have one meetup set up soon on the finance meetup group. Just please watch for that space. Thank you. Thank you, Charles.
Okay. Next slide. So I also talk about the event-driven architecture. I'm not going to go into the details of the event-driven architecture because by itself, it's a topic. It's going to take probably a lot of different sessions to even talk about it. What I'm trying to say, why event-driven architecture is important in the composable architecture world, because oftentimes when you have a composable architecture, they're distributed, not even distributed within your organization, and in many cases, it distributed across the internet. If you have a direct connection to all of those APIs, there's a lot of efficiency concerns there. And the event-driven architecture is the best way to best utilize the API approach and also to create efficiency. And the MuleSoft, of course, I have the diagram at the bottom. I quoted from our MuleSoft architecture, how you create an event-driven architecture. But if you have any questions, please raise at this moment. As I said, I'm not going to go into the details about the event-driven architecture. And many of you probably already know it. So if no question, I'm going to go to the next slide. So this is summary. I want everyone to take away from today's presentation is that the composable architecture is different from composability itself. One is an architecture, is an end-to-end concept or thinking about a business system that take advantage of technologies. It's not just a technical architecture. It's not. Remember, it consists of business architecture, technologies, and thinking. Thinking, that's where your creative and innovation comes in. So this is the most important takeaway point I would like everyone to remember. And in your practice, you may want to think one step further. What's our business model? How our business make money? And what's our capability model? And use that as a reference to direct your composability. Even one step further is composable architecture. So your API platform definition needs to align with your business architecture model. So that's what I want to convey for today's presentation.